I didn't set out to make a documentary about military motorcycles. I was researching D-Day landings and ran across this photograph. In it, soldiers are unloading a tiny motorcycle on D-Day. Not a Jeep, not a truck, but something that looks barely larger than a bicycle. After a little more research, I found out it was a British Welbike, designed to be dropped from the sky and ridden straight into combat. That image raises an obvious question. Why would an army ever think this was a good idea? And once you start asking that, you realize motorcycles have been a part of warfare for far longer and in more serious ways than most people remember. Before radios were small, reliable, and everywhere, armies faced a simple but dangerous problem. Information only moved as fast as the person carrying it. Orders, reports, requests for artillery support, and warnings about enemy movements all depended on someone physically getting from one unit to another. For centuries, that meant horses. By the late 19th century, bicycles began to supplement them. But industrial warfare was about to expose the limits of both. Modern battlefields were larger, more fluid, and far more lethal than anything armies had faced before. Horses required food, rest, and care, and they struggled under artillery fire and machine gun conditions. Bicycles were quiet and cheap, but limited by terrain. Mud, shell holes, and broken ground quickly turned them into dead weight. Armies needing something faster than a horse, more capable than a bicycle, and less demanding than early motor vehicles. Motorcycles filled that gap almost by accident. Early designs were mechanically simple, relatively inexpensive, and fast enough to matter. They could move across damaged roads and rough ground without the infrastructure demands of trucks or armored vehicles. Just as importantly, they could be maintained by the rider in many cases, without specialized tools or training. If something broke, it could often be fixed in the field, or abandoned without losing a critical asset. The motorcycle's first military value was not combat, it was communication. Dispatch riders carried written orders between headquarters and frontline units, often under fire. In wars defined by shifting front lines and fragmented command structures, minutes mattered. A motorcycle could cover distances far faster than a runner and without exhausting an animal that needed rest, water, and forage. There was also a logistical reality shaping their use. Early trucks were expensive, unreliable, and scarce. Fuel supply was inconsistent, spare parts were limited, and trained mechanics were in short supply. Motorcycles, by contrast, used less fuel, required fewer parts, and could be kept running with minimal support. For armies still adapting to mechanization, that made them attractive stopgap solutions. Motorcycles also occupied a useful middle ground between speed and visibility. A lone rider could move quickly without drawing the attention that came with larger vehicles. In an era before widespread aerial reconnaissance and electronic surveillance, this mattered. Reconnaissance units, military police, and liaison officers found that motorcycles allowed movement and coordination without advertising their presence. It's important to be clear about what motorcycles were not meant to do. They were never intended to replace cavalry in combat, and they were never designed to charge enemy positions. Their value was narrow and practical. They existed to solve specific problems created by modern war: distance, time, and communication, at a moment when technology had not yet caught up with the scale of the battlefield. That narrow usefulness explains their uneven history. Whenever armies modernized faster than their infrastructure could support, motorcycles made sense. When radios improved, roads expanded, and vehicles became cheaper and more reliable, motorcycles lost their place. This cycle of adoption, reliance, and decline defines the military motorcycle's story, and it begins not with daring riders or heroic charges, but with the simple need to get a message where it needed to go, faster than anything else could manage at the time. When the First World War began in 1914, no army entered the conflict with a defined doctrine for motorcycle use. Their appearance on the battlefield was largely improvised. As front lines expanded and command structures struggled to keep pace, existing methods of communication proved inadequate. Runners were slow and exposed, horses were increasingly vulnerable under artillery fire, field telephones worked only until their wires were cut, which happened frequently. Motorcycles began filling that gap almost immediately. Early on, many were civilian machines pressed into service, often ridden by volunteers who supplied their own bikes. Commanders quickly recognized that motorcycles could move messages faster than any alternative that did not depend on rails, intact roads, or animals. In a war where delays could collapse an entire operation, that speed mattered. Dispatch riding quickly became one of the most dangerous roles in the Army. Riders moved between headquarters and forward units through shell fire, gas clouds, and small arms fire, often navigating terrain that no longer resembled roads. There was no protection beyond speed and awareness. Casualties were high, but the role remained indispensable because there was no reliable substitute. Different armies adopted motorcycles in slightly different ways. The British were among the earliest to formalize their use, fielding large numbers of standardized machines such as the Triumph Model H, often cited as one of the first true military motorcycles. It emphasized durability over performance, a choice shaped by the harsh realities of the Western Front. French and German forces followed similar paths, integrating motorcycles into dispatch, reconnaissance, and escort roles. The United States entered the war later, but once committed, rapidly expanded motorcycle use to support its growing expeditionary forces. American units relied heavily on domestically produced motorcycles, including early military models from Harley-Davidson. Like their European counterparts, these machines were not designed for combat. They carried no weapons and provided no protection. Their purpose was movement. They connected units, coordinated advances, and kept commanders informed in an environment where information routinely arrived too late. World War I also revealed the motorcycle's limitations. Mud was a constant enemy. Trench systems destroyed roads, and shell craters turned open ground into impassable obstacles. Riders frequently dismounted and pushed their machines forward. Mechanical reliability suffered, and maintenance became a daily challenge. In winter conditions, motorcycles were often rendered unusable altogether. Despite these drawbacks, motorcycles proved their value. They worked often enough and moved fast enough to justify their continued use. More importantly, they taught armies what a military motorcycle needed to be. Civilian designs were inadequate. Frames had to be stronger. Engines had to be simpler and more robust. Controls needed to function while wearing gloves and carrying equipment. These were lessons learned through failure as much as success. Just as importantly, the war clarified what motorcycles could not do. They were not replacements for vehicles in sustained operations, and they were ineffective once terrain deteriorated beyond a certain point. Their usefulness was conditional, tied to weather, infrastructure, and the tempo of operations. That understanding shaped how militaries viewed motorcycles going forward. By the end of the war, motorcycles had secured a defined but limited place in military organizations. They had proven themselves as tools of communication and coordination, not combat. Rather than abandoning them, armies began refining them. The interwar years would be spent turning hard-earned experience into purpose-built designs, preparing for a future conflict that planners assumed would be larger, faster, and even more demanding than the last. By the time the Second World War began, motorcycles were no longer improvised tools pressed into service. Every major power entered the conflict with motorcycles already written into doctrine, procurement plans, and unit tables. The lessons of the First World War had been absorbed. Motorcycles would not win battles on their own, but they could move information, personnel, and light loads faster than almost anything else available on the ground. In a war defined by speed and coordination, that was enough to justify their widespread use. World War II was the high watermark for military motorcycles because it combined three conditions that favored them. First, armies expanded faster than infrastructure could keep up. Second, radios, while improving, were still limited by range, reliability, and security. Third, motor vehicles were valuable and scarce, and commanders needed cheaper, more flexible alternatives for many tasks. Motorcycles filled that space. They appeared everywhere. Dispatch riders carried orders between headquarters and frontline units. Reconnaissance elements used motorcycles to probe ahead of advancing formations. Military police relied on them for traffic control, escort duties, and rear area security. Liaison officers used them to move between units that were advancing too quickly for wired communications to follow. In these roles, motorcycles were not auxiliary equipment. They were essential connective tissue. Different armies emphasized different approaches. Allied forces generally favored simplicity and standardization. The United States, in particular, leaned heavily on the Harley-Davidson WLA, a rugged, straightforward machine designed to be reliable rather than sophisticated. It was not fast by civilian standards, but it was durable, easy to maintain, and well suited to mass production. Tens of thousands were built, and they served in nearly every theater of war. The WLA reflected a broader Allied philosophy. Motorcycles were tools, not platforms. They were meant to move people and information, not to fight. While sidecars and mounted weapons existed in limited numbers, they were the exception rather than the rule. Most Allied motorcycles remained unarmed, their value measured in speed, availability, and endurance rather than firepower. Germany took a different path. German planners saw motorcycles not just as transport, but as integrated battlefield assets. This thinking produced some of the most distinctive military motorcycles ever built, particularly heavy sidecar combinations designed to operate alongside mechanized units. The most famous of these were the BMW R75 and the Zundap KS750. These machines were complex by motorcycle standards. They featured driven sidecar wheels, locking differentials, and robust suspensions intended to handle poor roads and off-road conditions. Some were armed with machine guns. In theory, they offered mobility, firepower, and versatility in a single package. In practice, they were heavy, mechanically demanding, and difficult to maintain in the field. German reliance on motorcycle units peaked during the early years of the war, particularly during the rapid advances of 1939 through 1941. As the war dragged on and conditions worsened, the limitations of complex machines became more apparent. Losses mounted, maintenance became difficult, and motorcycles increasingly gave way to armored vehicles and trucks as resources allowed. Across all armies, the realities of combat shaped how motorcycles were actually used. Speed helped, but it did not make riders invulnerable. Casualties among motorcycle troops were significant, especially in forward areas. As the war progressed, motorcycles were increasingly pushed into roles that balanced utility with survivability. At the same time, the war produced some of the most extreme experiments in motorcycle design and use. None was more unusual than the British Welbike. Designed for airborne forces, the Welbike was a collapsible motorcycle small enough to fit into a container dropped by parachute. The idea was straightforward: give paratroopers immediate mobility after landing, allowing them to regroup, scout, and carry messages faster than troops on foot. On paper, the Welbike made sense. In practice, it revealed the limits of innovation under combat conditions. As with a lot of airborne equipment, containers often landed far from the troops meant to retrieve them. Assembly took time, tools, and calm that were rarely available immediately after a drop. The bike itself was underpowered, unsuspended, and difficult to ride on rough ground. While it saw limited use, particularly during airborne operations in Europe, it never became a reliable solution. The Welbike mattered not because it succeeded, but because it showed how far militaries were willing to go to preserve mobility. It represented the extreme edge of motorcycle utility, where weight, size, and transportability mattered more than durability or comfort. It also demonstrated a recurring pattern in military technology. Tools designed for very specific problems often struggle when those problems collide with real-world chaos. By the later years of the war, motorcycles were still present but increasingly overshadowed. Radios improved, vehicle production increased, roads, airfields, and supply networks expanded behind advancing armies. The narrow advantages that motorcycles once offered began to shrink. They remained useful, but less central than they had been at the war's outset. World War II ultimately marked both the peak and the turning point for military motorcycles. Never before or since would they be produced in such numbers or used across such a wide range of roles. At the same time, the war exposed their limitations with brutal clarity. They worked best in transitional moments, when armies were moving fast, infrastructure was thin, and alternatives were unavailable. As soon as those conditions changed, motorcycles began to fade into the background. That shift would define their post-war fate. The Second World War proved that motorcycles could be indispensable under the right circumstances. It also showed that those circumstances were temporary. The Cold War that followed would be shaped by technologies that made the lone rider less necessary and far more vulnerable than ever before. The end of the Second World War did not immediately eliminate military motorcycles, but it did change the environment that had made them useful. Armies downsized, reorganized, and invested heavily in technologies that reduced their dependence on human messengers. Radios became smaller, more reliable, and more secure. Vehicles became cheaper, more plentiful, and easier to maintain. The narrow advantages motorcycles once held began to disappear. During the early Cold War, motorcycles lingered mostly because they were already in inventory and because militaries were cautious about abandoning proven tools too quickly. They continued to serve in familiar roles: military police, traffic control, courier duties, and base security. In these contexts, they were efficient and economical. They required little fuel, minimal training, and limited logistical support. For peacetime armies focused on readiness rather than rapid maneuver, that was enough to keep them around. Combat doctrine, however, was moving in a different direction. The Cold War battlefield was expected to be faster, more mechanized, and far more lethal. Nuclear weapons, armored formations, and integrated air power dominated planning. In that environment, exposed riders carrying messages between units made little sense. Command and control increasingly relied on layered communication system rather than physical movement. Where redundancy was required, it came from additional radios, not additional riders. The Korean War illustrated this shift clearly. While motorcycles were present, their role was limited and often peripheral. The terrain, climate, and pace of fighting worked against them. Cold weather reduced reliability. Rough ground limited mobility. Most importantly, radios in vehicles were sufficiently available that motorcycles were no longer essential. They became tools of convenience rather than necessity. By the time of the Vietnam War, the decline was unmistakable. Vietnam represented nearly every condition that undermined the motorcycle's usefulness. Dense jungle restricted movement. Poor roads and seasonal flooding made riding hazardous or impossible. Mines and ambushes turned exposed travel into a serious liability. Helicopters provided rapid mobility that motorcycles could not compete with, especially for reconnaissance and liaison roles. Motorcycles did not vanish entirely in Vietnam, but their use was narrowly confined. Military police employed them for traffic control and escort duties on established roads. Base security units used them for patrols within relatively controlled areas. In urban environments, they offered some flexibility. What they did not do was shape operations. They no longer carried the burden of communication or coordination the way they had in earlier wars. This reduction was not the result of a single failure or doctrinal decision. It was the cumulative effect of changing conditions. Radios had finally become reliable enough to replace runners and riders. Vehicles were abundant enough to handle transport tasks without rationing. Air mobility removed the need for ground-based messengers in many situations. Each advancement eroded a small piece of the motorcycle's relevance until very little remained. There was also a survivability calculation at work. As weapons became more accurate and widespread, the vulnerability of motorcycle riders became harder to justify. In earlier wars, exposure was accepted because there were no alternatives. By Vietnam, alternatives existed. Sending an unarmored rider into contested areas no longer made operational sense. By the end of the Vietnam War, the military motorcycle had been largely pushed into the margins. It survived in roles where visibility, speed, and cost still mattered, but it no longer influenced how wars were planned or fought. For many observers, it appeared to be an outdated relic, a tool that belonged to a different era of warfare. That perception would hold for several decades. Yet, as with earlier periods of transition, the conditions that eliminated motorcycles would eventually give way to new ones. The wars that followed Vietnam would introduce different problems. Problems that, once again, left a small but meaningful space for the return of the military motorcycle in a very different form. By the late 20th century, the motorcycle's disappearance from frontline military thinking appeared complete. Advanced radios, satellite communications, armored vehicles, and air mobility had replaced nearly every role motorcycles once filled. For conventional forces preparing for large-scale mechanized war, there was little reason to revisit an exposed, lightly equipped platform that seemed better suited to an earlier era. Yet modern conflicts did not unfold the way Cold War planners expected. Instead of large, clearly defined front lines, many post-Cold War operations took place in fragmented environments with uneven control, limited infrastructure, and constant movement among civilian populations. In these conditions, speed and discretion sometimes mattered more than protection. This opened a narrow but important space for the return of the military motorcycle. Small, specialized units were among the first to re-examine the concept. Small units operating independently needed mobility that was fast, flexible, and easy to transport. Motorcycles could be moved by helicopter or cargo aircraft, required minimal logistical support, and could navigate terrain that limited larger vehicles. In certain missions, they offered a balance of speed and low profile that neither trucks nor armored vehicles could match. Modern military motorcycles differed fundamentally from their World War II predecessors. They were not intended for mass issue or standardized doctrine. Instead, they were niche tools selected for specific tasks. One example was the use of modified off-road motorcycles, such as the Kawasaki KLR 650, adapted for patrol, liaison, and reconnaissance roles. These bikes emphasized reliability, range, and ease of maintenance rather than speed or combat capability. Another example was the development of the Hayes M1030 M1, designed to run on the same fuel as other military vehicles. This addressed one of the traditional logistical objections to motorcycles by simplifying fuel supply. While produced in limited numbers, it reflected a modern approach: motorcycles as specialized assets rather than general-purpose tools. In contemporary use, motorcycles are rarely employed in direct combat roles. Their value lies in mobility, access, and presence. They are used for route reconnaissance, patrols in low-threat areas, and liaison tasks where rapid movement is essential. In some cases, they serve psychological and cultural purposes, allowing forces to blend more naturally into environments where motorcycles are common civilian vehicles. The modern revival of military motorcycles does not represent a return to their former prominence. Instead, it reflects a refined understanding of their strengths and weaknesses. They are used where their advantages are clear and avoided where their vulnerabilities outweigh their benefits. This selective approach contrasts sharply with the mass deployment seen during World War II. Ultimately, modern military motorcycles exist because modern warfare still produces gaps. Whenever armies operate faster than infrastructure allows, or in environments where heavy vehicles draw too much attention, motorcycles regain relevance. They are not relics, nor are they central to contemporary doctrine. They persist as adaptable tools, quietly filling roles that more advanced systems cannot easily replace. The story of military motorcycles is not one of replacement, but of compression. Each time warfare changed shape, a small space opened for them to return. That pattern explains why they never truly vanished, even after their apparent decline in the mid-20th century. Motorcycles persist because they solve a specific set of problems better than almost anything else. They are inexpensive compared to vehicles, easy to transport, and quick to deploy. They require minimal infrastructure and can operate where roads are poor or incomplete. For small units working independently, those traits still matter. In environments where speed, access, and discretion outweigh protection, motorcycles remain viable. Training and logistics also favor them in limited roles. Riders can be trained quickly, maintenance is straightforward, fuel consumption is low. When forces operate far from established supply chains, those factors reduce friction. While motorcycles cannot replace vehicles or aircraft, they can complement them in situations where larger systems are inefficient or impractical. There is also a human factor. Motorcycles allow direct interaction with terrain and populations in ways vehicles often cannot. They can move through narrow streets, rural paths, and crowded areas without the same visual or psychological footprint. In certain missions, that matters more than armor or firepower. What history makes clear is that motorcycles succeed when expectations are narrow and fail when expectations are inflated. They work best as tools, not platforms. Every time militaries have tried to turn them into something more, mobile weapon systems, substitutes for vehicles, or universal solutions, they have fallen short. When used for movement, communication, and access, they endure. That reality explains their uneven but persistent presence across more than a century of warfare. Military motorcycles are not symbols of nostalgia or innovation. They are reminders that even as technology advances, some problems remain stubbornly physical: distance, terrain, and time. And sometimes the simplest solutions still have a place. That brings the story back to the photograph that started this documentary. Soldiers on a beach on D-Day, unloading a motorcycle that looks almost out of place. The Welbike wasn't a success in the traditional sense. It was awkward, limited, and quickly outgrown. But it existed because, in that moment, mobility mattered more than perfection. Military motorcycles appear whenever war outpaces its own infrastructure. They disappear when better options arrive. And then, quietly, they return. Not because they are ideal, but because under the right conditions, they are still useful. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.